Hello everybody. In this video, we are going to approach a new literary genre, which is poetry. We are going to explain what poetry is. In addition, we will give the characteristics that make poetry different from other literary genres. Moreover, we are going to discuss the main elements and the main types of poetry. Poetry has no exact definition. It is difficult to define. The most distinguishing feature of poetry is its use of language. Traditional poems are arranged according to certain formal and metrical rules. Poetry is different from the other prosaic genres. It is written in stanza form, while the other genres are written in prose and paragraph form. In general, poetry is the use and arrangement of words in ways which create certain effects and convey certain experience. By experience, we mean something the poet feels, sees, or does. At the beginning of the 16th century, many poets started using what came to be called blank verse, that is, poetry which is metered but not rhymed. Most English and American poetry today does not rely on meter. Now, let us begin talking about the types of poetry. First, the narrative poetry is the first type of poetry. In this type of poetry, the speaker tells a story. The whole poem should be narrative to be considered as a narrative poem. If we have a poem that includes narrative moments, it is not considered as a narrative poem. What are the characteristics of narrative poetry? As any narrative in general, a narrative poem has a story with a beginning and an end. There is a plot, there are characters, there is setting, and there are ideas. Narrative poetry has a structure similar to that of the short story. Homer's epic, the Iliad, is a good example of narrative poetry. The second type of poetry is descriptive poetry. It simply means poetry which is based on description. In this kind of poetry, poets describe their sweethearts, mistresses, birds, animals, and elements of nature. Most of modern poetry is descriptive, especially what is called imagistic poetry. An excellent example of a descriptive poem is William Carlos Williams' The Red Wheelbarrow. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rain water beside the white chickens. The third type of poetry is the dramatic poetry. It is poetry in which the poet depicts situations dramatically. There are two main types of dramatic poetry. The first is based on dialogue between the speaker and another character. The other type is called the dramatic monologue. In this type, the speaker talks to himself. The fourth type of poetry is the meditative poetry. It is poetry that is based on the expression of thought. Generally speaking, we call a poem meditative when it has somewhat elaborate philosophical treatment of a subject. John Donne's A Valediction is an excellent example of meditative poetry. The fifth type of poetry is the satiric poetry. It is a poetry which diminishes a subject by making it look ridiculous. It is built on exaggeration, in which the poet portrays the negative side of the subject with distortion of facts. It is also built on two strategies, which are parody and mock epic. Parody means the imitation of a serious situation with the aim of mocking it. The sixth type of poetry is the epic poetry. It is a long narrative poem dealing with a serious great subject composed in an elevated style, focusing on the actions of a person on whose actions depends a large group of people. Some of the famous epics are Homer's The Iliad and Odyssey and the anonymous Anglo-Saxon epic Beowulf. The seventh type of poetry is the ballad. It is a short poem whose author is unknown, and it is usually sung. It is either dramatic or narrative in style. It is essentially folk song. The eighth type of poetry is the sonnet. It is a 14-line poem, usually about love. We have three types of sonnet. The first called the Shakespearean or the English sonnet. It consists of 3 quatrains, a 4-line stanza, and a couplet. The second type is called the Petrarchan or the Italian sonnet. It consists of assisted, a 6-line stanza, and the octave, an 8-line stanza. The third type is called the Spenserian sonnet. We will elaborate more on this type of poetry in the next video. The ninth type of poetry is the lyric. It is a fairly short poem, usually non-narrative, presenting a single speaker who expresses a state of mind, a feeling, or an idea. It is often rhythmic and sung-like, and it is usually the first person. Marvel's to his coy mistress is a good example of the lyric poetry. The 10th type of poetry is the ode. It is a lyric, but its language is loftier, its tone is more serious, and its argument is more elaborate. It is usually a philosophical, descriptive, and a meditative poem. The last type is the elegy. It is a lyric written to lament the death of a person, usually of eminent status. It highlights the positive deeds of the dead person. Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard is an example of elegy. The other thing to discuss is the elements of poetry. The first element and the most important is the figurative language. Whenever you describe something by comparing it with something else, you are using figurative language. We have a number of figures of speech, among them the following. First, imagery. Imagery means to use figurative language to represent objects, actions, and ideas in such a way that it appeals to our physical senses. For example, it was dark and dim in the forest. The words dark and dim are visual images. Second, simile. A simile uses the words like or as to compare one object or idea with another to suggest they are alike. Example, busy as a bee. Third, metaphor. The metaphor states a fact or draws a verbal picture by the use of comparison. A simile would say you are like something. A metaphor is more positive. It says you are something. Example, you are what you eat. Fourth, personification. It is a figure of speech in which human characteristics are given to an animal or an object. Example, my teddy bear give me a hug. Fifth, symbolism. It uses something concrete to represent an abstract concept. For example, to Christians, the cross symbolizes human sin. Finally, irony. Irony is a figure of speech in which words are used in such a way that their intended meaning is different from the actual meaning of the words. The other element of poetry is prosody. Prosody means the study of meter, intonation, and rhythm of a poetic work. It is a phonetic term that uses meter, rhythm, tempo, pitch, and loudness in speech for conveying information about the meanings and the structure of an utterance. In addition, prosody is an important element of language that contributes towards rhythmic and acoustic effects in a piece of writing. It includes different elements such as scansion, sound, pace, and meaning. We will elaborate more in prosody when we discuss the poems. At the end of this video, I hope it to be beneficial to you. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.